Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar, which is part of a broader project that we have at Just World Educational called The World After COVID, in which we're examining various different aspects of the rapid way that the world is changing since the outbreak of COVID earlier this year. Obviously, food insecurity, hunger, starvation, they are a key part of what is happening after COVID and to a certain extent before COVID, but COVID makes it all a lot worse in many parts of the world, including here in the United States, but obviously even worse in other parts of the world. Oxfam America, indeed, is now warning that by the end of the year, roughly 12,000 people may be dying each day worldwide from COVID-related starvation, which they say could be worse than the disease itself. So it's a wonderful time for us to be able to welcome onto the webinar series Professor Hilal Elver. She served from 2014 until April of this year as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. She's a professor of international law, a global distinguished fellow at the UCLA Law School's Resnick Food Law and Policy Center. Previously, she held a distinguished chair at the Mediterranean Academy of Diplomatic Studies in Malta. She served the Turkish government in various capacities, including as a member of the country's team at the climate change negotiations. So Hilal Elver, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I'm going to have a wonderful conversation with Hilal later on, but just before we start, I want to remind everybody who has joined the webinar that first of all, Hilal and I will have our 30-minute conversation, and after that, we'll have a Q&A session. If you want to submit questions, obviously have them be relevant to this topic, have them be short and to the point, and submit them through the chat box. That's the best way. You could do it through the Q&A button, but we find generally the chat box is better, and then they will be reviewed by my colleague Charlotte Cates, whom you can't see on your screen right now, but Charlotte is working behind the scenes. She's actually posting on the chat box some useful links for you. She can answer your technical questions if you have any, and most important of all, she will be reviewing all the questions that people have for Hilal Elver, and then after, when we do the Q&A, Charlotte will actually be hosting that and fielding the questions. Just before we get into the conversation, I want to remind you that the video of today's session will, like those of the preceding webinars, be published at our resource center, which you can see, there's the link, bit.ly/WAC resources. I invite you to visit and explore the resource center, where you'll find many intriguing conversations and resources to do with the world after COVID. So now here's the important part of the program, of course, the central part of the program. Hilal Elver, you were the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Can you tell us what that job entails?
Okay, first of all, it's a good opportunity for me to explain a little bit what these special rapporteurs are and this system and what they do. Human Rights Council appoint independent experts for 6 years from the world based on their expertise. Almost every human rights excuse me, I think there's we are having always Zoom in the same house, two different subjects. Now the door is closed. Okay. So special rapporteurship can be thematic, and it can be a kind of country focus. For instance, UN Special Rapporteurs on Palestine occupied territories that discussing and dealing with the human rights issues in only Palestine. But the thematic special rapporteurs have their own thematic area, for instance, food, housing, health, and water, environment, toxics, all kind of, or violence against women, freedom of religion. These experts are going around the world investigating specific countries and bringing the reports to the United Nations Human Rights Council and in New York. And also we also prepare every year 2 thematic reports in specific areas. So it's a very hefty work. It's a lot of traveling, a lot of writing, kind of official reports. It's an important position in terms of power, access to decision-making mechanism, high level of the governmental bodies, and also honorary position. We are not part of the civil servants of the United Nations. We do this without a salary because human rights experts should be totally independent. We are not connected with the UN, or we are not connected with any other countries. So this is the short explanation what the special rapporteurs are and what they're doing.
Well, thank you. That's great. I'd also like to unpack the right to food part of this, because the right to food, in a sense, of course, it's symbolic of the right to a decent economy in general, and yeah, the current crisis of the food system is a symbol of the current economic crisis around the world. And it's part of the basket of economic and social rights that most countries in the world have actually signed on to, but our country here in the United States has not. So does that make your work more difficult?
Well, it's interesting because right to food is almost well known for everyone, but the concept, what includes right to food, is not well known. And every government, every countries in the world, including United States, they understand the fundamental value of the right to food, but at the same time, very often violated rights. So it's a kind of confusing concept. The concept is, yes, United States is not a signatory of the Economic Social Rights Covenant, but US is not the only one. Many of the Western countries, actually, all the Commonwealth countries and Europe, they are not really supporting economic and social rights directly like United States. So developing countries are much more active in this area, unlike the US and the Western countries are more active in civil and political rights. It's a sort of world divided to two, like the Cold War legacy that it's still continuing. So the right to food, as you said, doesn't mean that government is responsible to its citizens, but doesn't mean that they will give them a food in a normal world, but they have to have a decent structure that the people can either produce themselves for their family or market, or they have a decent job that they can have accessibility of the food in the market. So it is not a charity. For instance, we talk about right now food banks. As you know, during the COVID period, food banks became so important, but food banks has nothing to do with the right to food, because in emergency situation, of course, government steps in or NGO steps in to help people, but the human rights-based right to food, human rights concept gives to citizens and people the right to ask questions, right to access to decision-making mechanism, monitoring, and the access to justice, this kind of sometimes scary kind of procedural rights that many countries are reluctant to be responsible against their own people. And all economic social rights, there's a one problem that is not as strong as civil and political rights, because countries can have a kind of escaping concept if they have enough economic power. They will get away not to be able to provide a right to food properly. So many of the countries, they call progressive realization of the economic and social rights, which means, yes, we are responsible, we're gonna do it, but it has to be progressive. When we develop, we will do better. That's a kind of escaping part of the right to food concept.
So now we are in this new era where COVID is devastating economies around the world. How has it highlighted the fragility of food systems around the world? Do you have any little vignettes, or you can give us figures? Or
of course. First of all, COVID was very, very unpredictable. It was unpredictable, and when it started first, no government understood where it will go. And when World Health Organization announced in March, pandemic was a kind of shocking for many countries, including United States, including Italy, for instance, which very interestingly enough, COVID hit first to Western, except China, from Wuhan, came to Europe, but it was unusually affected Europe and the United States and developed countries, unlike other, for instance, SARS or Ebola or
Zika. Yeah.
All of them were kind of developing countries' problem, and Europe and United States didn't really pay too much attention. We didn't really care too much, because I know Ebola was significantly affected African food system, but we didn't even hear it because it didn't come here. But in COVID, directly affected European countries. And these European countries have a very sophisticated food security system. They are basically food secure, and their value chain, global value chain, is very sophisticated, and basically they are producers. But COVID affected first food workers, because when lockdown started and the food workers were not able to work anymore, and suddenly in Italy and Germany, all the very good production, for instance, white asparagus or strawberries, all kinds of very important high-level food pieces were not able to reach the market. So this, of course, this doesn't mean that Europeans become hungry. No, because we have incredible amount of the food surplus in the world. As if today we have a food surplus. There is no problem about the availability of the food. But the problem is accessibility. People lost their jobs. People lost their access. People lost their this sophisticated global food chain interrupted suddenly because transportation was not important, and major countries that they produce, for instance, Russia, China, US didn't do too much, but Vietnam, for instance, stopped exporting rice. So that became a kind of problematic. FAO was very strongly suggesting, please don't do it, because you have enough warehouses. You don't have to put your self-sufficiency in the front line. And they sort of FAO announced solidarity.
So FAO is the Food and Agriculture Organization.
Yes, food and agriculture, it's like under the United Nations umbrella. Food and Agriculture Organization, basically policymakers of all these food and agricultural areas, which basic responsibility, which 1948 was established, eliminating hunger and rural poverty and supporting the agriculture system. It's a very sophisticated, knowledge-based, very well-maintained United Nations body. But also they are very much free market oriented. They didn't like this food value chain and global economic order that food is traveling around the world that would be interrupted. They said, please don't go to self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency is not good. Why not, open the borders for food, because global economic order is capable to feed the world. So that is also very interesting and ideologically very much free market, capitalist order that now food system is a very major part of it.
But I think now there's a lot more focus on food security, especially for food insecure small nations. And that will be a continuing concern, presumably.
So that's interesting enough, because COVID-19 actually did not do too much damage in the long term yet, because we don't know how long it's going to go. We don't know next harvest will be affected, because food security issues was already under serious threat, despite the last 3 decades where food insecurity was decreasing. Since 2014, hunger and malnutrition is increasing, which was very strange. That's why FAO was trying to understand why we can't eliminate it, hunger and malnutrition, and also increasing. And there are several of the reasons of this. One is, of course, basic. Number one problem is basically a conflict area. As you know, Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa is very much under the stress of, Yemen, Sudan, Syria, Republic of Congo, Nigeria, all the Chad region. They are under series of the conflict, which basically hunger is a very strong problem. The second is, of course, climate change, extreme weather event. Now there's a flood, there's a water shortage, there is a serious kind of issues. And then economic volatility, especially developing countries, economy is going up and down, and people's affordability, accessibility of the food is becoming not sustainable. So food security, when we say food security, when you are thinking, I am food secure, you have to secure for all the time, not when you have a job. When you lose the job, you lose your food security. So that's why it's a very problematic right now. It used to be since 2014. The COVID-19 become kind of like the steroid on this problem of the food insecurity in certain areas. This is maybe not much in Europe and the United States, because 95% of the US and United States citizens are okay or moderately food insecure. But also food security has a levels, high level, starvation, famine, emergency. There are different kind of levels. If you look at these levels, the figures are going huge high. For instance, 2 days ago, FAO published their SOFI report. SOFI means State of Food Insecurity Report 2020. You can see in internet, everybody talks about it, because this is a very strong issue. Food insecurity is increasing, everywhere, but sub-Saharan Africa is in terrible shape. Latin America is fastly growing food insecurity. So this
I'm actually just going to share a map that I have. It's not from that FAO report that you mentioned, but it's by actually, I think the chief economist of the FAO had produced this.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
as
Maximo Torero, right? Maximo Torero.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, as you said, sub-Saharan Africa, and actually a lot of the Central American countries are the reds, the hot spots there. Yes. So yes, precisely what you've been talking about. I'd like to just touch for a moment on food security issues here in the United States, and more broadly, the fact that I think Raj Patel is somebody who's written about the fact that you have, you know, obesity at some levels and starvation at others, and the obesity and related things like diabetes are, in a sense, symbols of a food of a food system gone completely haywire, with corn syrup and all the dreadful things that American agricultural corporations put into the food system here. And it turns out that they are comorbidities for COVID, and that people who have, you know, obesity or diabetes are much more vulnerable to COVID. So you have these two things at the same time, you know, food insecurity and then obesity. How does that work?
Well, it's interesting because hunger and malnutrition, when we talk about this, hunger part is a government many of the governments are more comfortable to talk about the hunger, but they are not very comfortable to talk about the malnutrition, because malnutrition is huge. If we put together malnutrition and undernutrition, because when we say malnutrition, there are undernutrition, micronutrient inefficiency, and obesity or overnutrition. You wouldn't put overnutrition. They say overnutrition is not a good word according to dietitians. So first time in the world right now, undernutrition is lower than the obesity and nutrient inefficiency. So malnutrition is universal, not only is developing countries, then the United States and all developed countries come into the malnutrition problem. They have significant problem. For instance, US has 60% of people in the United States, you should think about it, overweight and obese. This is the recipe of the non-communicable diseases, as you said. What is non-communicable diseases? Non-communicable diseases mostly comes from diet, but also comes from substance use or genetic deformation, this and that. But if we talk about the diet, we can significantly reduce the increase of the non-communicable diseases, which is cancer is one of them, and heart disease, and high blood pressure, and diabetes. These are the major reasons of people die. And the impact of the malnutrition and the non-communicable diseases, trillions of dollars. So if we make it diet system more reasonable, we're going to be able to solve the health issues. COVID really showed that, you know, 90% of the COVID death, either obese or diabetics, or diabetics and obese comes together anyway.
Right.
So, and more interesting, that all these people are the lower economic conditions. So these diseases and the bad diet is connected with how much money you have. So inequality economic justice, social justice comes in together. Yeah.
Right. So in your report, your final report that you submitted as United Nations Special Rapporteur, which I read with great interest, you advocate the concept of food citizenship. Tell us more about that. It's a fantastic concept.
Yeah, there are lots of concepts that we keep talking about it, always to find a new way. It is good. For instance, food sovereignty, it was much more known subject matter in the food policy area, sort of opposite of the food security. Food security is bringing, I put it all of them because the citizenship comes after. Food security is bringing by the United States against the right to food. Because they said, human rights approach, we don't accept, food security is important. When we talk about food security, production. You produce a lot. Yes, and they manage. This is it. Food sovereignty comes from Latin American rural communities. They try to say, we would like to produce what we want and how we want. And we have to be independent are making decision, and there will not be a kind of global corporate interest to tell us what to do. The food sovereignty concept is more democratically making decision. Food citizenship, however, it's a much more newer concept. Actually, there is a one Jeffrey English NGO about the food justice. They use first, and I also influence from them to get this concept, because food is not anymore only interest of the government, interest of the corporation, interest of the farmers, interest of food for everyone. Citizenship means we are responsible what we eat, what we choose, how we question. So this is our responsibility as a citizen. So citizenship means we are not only a subject, but also agency. We have to make and participate. For instance, there are many places in city councils right now in the United States and Canada and Europe. The cities are trying to make their own food policies, and citizens are directly responsible and participating into that kind of sort of like a citizenship from below rather than above. Making decision by the supermarket chain. So that's a kind of concept I'm trying to promote.
Oh, that's great. So it would be supporting local producers and green markets. And I'd like to talk to you about the effects that agricultural subsidies here in the United States and in Europe, primarily in the US and Europe, the effects that agricultural subsidies to our farmers have on food systems in very low income countries, because that's something that's been a concern of mine for many years.
Yes, actually, the one basic problem is this, food subsidies are taking over the market in a global order, because our American farmers and European farmers are sort of in the social security system. They have no problem of accessing the market because they are getting subsidies. It's a very political also in Midwest, for instance, all the big time big time farmers are connected with the subsidies, and subsidies are not for everything, which makes us basically sick. For instance, what US gives the subsidies: corn, which is problematic, wheat, soy. So these three of them. So which one is better for our nutrition system? None of them. When they, for instance, sometimes I heard anecdotal, this farmers, they plant a little bit of tomato or vegetables. They said, no, no, no. They cut their subsidies when they see the vegetables, because vegetables are specialty food, and specialty food are not subject to subsidies. This is completely unacceptable. Forget about the countries, developing countries, market destroy. We are destroying our own health system. So that subsidies should be definitely reconsidered. When we talk about the subsidies, farmers get so nervous. I was at the meeting in Washington with the Congress people and a lot of farmers. When I talk about the subsidies, they said, don't touch our subsidies. So I understood it's a very delicate matter. They don't want to be touched because it's a very serious issue. Otherwise, they can't. But now the market is completely disappeared. Nobody buys corn anymore because basically corn goes either animal feeding or methanol. The gas prices is so low. Oil price, nobody is anymore. So that kind of policies should change in depending on the conditions. Now the market is completely up and down because of the COVID, because of the oil prices. So subsidies are not anymore, or you just give the subsidy to people that don't survive because they can't sell anything. So European is another problem. In Europe, the biggest subsidy receiver, guess who? Queen Elizabeth.
A very poor, hard-working farm woman.
Yeah, because it's based on the land acre, they get the subsidies. And many kind of livestock farmers in Netherlands, they were poor farmers. Now they are the billionaires.
I mean, I think the same thing has happened here. You know, I haven't looked at the figures for quite a while, but there's an organization called the Environmental Working Group that breaks out like what proportion of the money that the agricultural subsidies goes to the very big producers and what proportion goes to the small producers. And of course, you know, when it's sold to politicians in this country, it's sold as, you know, we've got to support the small farmer. It's not supporting the small farmer.
Not. The small farmer subsidy is a different one, very limited.
Yeah. So, and meantime, those subsidies do help wipe out whole agricultural sectors in low-income countries like cotton in Africa or whatever.
Another thing about the subsidy before going other, because it's very important, United States is the biggest food humanitarians in the world. Guess why they doing? Because they get all these farmers wheat and all kind of production dumped to the Africa. When they are dumping them, also they use American ships transportation, and huge amount of money is going to this American transportation and American farmers in order to get the food aid to Africa. During the Obama administration, he tried to change this. He changed significantly, but I don't know right now what happened. So this is a very trillions of, not billions, trillions of money goes through this food aid, US food aid.
Yeah. I mean, that is definitely one way in which, you know, US policy affects people and farmers and consumers in low-income countries. The other, of course, is sanctions. And we have to talk about sanctions in the context of, if there is a right to food, how can sanctions be maintained on countries like Iran or Syria or Venezuela or Cuba? I mean...
The sanction is one of the issues that I seriously took. and I made very strong several of press releases on that, because especially in the COVID time, going to economic sanction is crimes against humanity, because these countries are already in terrible situation, and the argument is sanctions are make them peaceful manner or disarmament, this and that. But in actually, these sanctions only hurt ordinary people, never elite of Iran, never elite of Venezuela, never. But the poor people are directly impacted by economic sanction. When I was in Zimbabwe, I was in the mission trip in Zimbabwe, I was shocked because whole Zimbabwe was suffering because of the Mugabe period, 20 years under the sanction of the United States. It is a very serious issue, and American ambassador was very upset with me putting this in my report. They said, oh, we are very limited sanctions, only the people, but it is not true, because when you have a sanction, no international organizations comes and helps to the countries like that. Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, Zimbabwe, many more. So the sanction issues is absolutely political disaster. Let's put it this way.
I mean, we should have learned that in the 1990s with,
yes.
you know, what happened in Iraq.
Yes.
Fully documented.
Yes.
And,
yes.
You know, as Madeleine Albright said at the time,
yes.
you know, 500,000 Iraqi children died because of sanctions. That was a price worth paying.
Yes. She lost all political future with this sentence.
That's true. That's true. So I know that you and various other organizations have produced sort of lists of, you know, the 10 things that have to be done to save the world from the food crisis caused by COVID. Could you, for maybe, since most of the people watching this live are here in the United States, what would be the 2 or 3 things that we could do, should do, that would be effective, long-term or short-term?
Yeah, most important thing in the US and everywhere, social security, social protection is extremely important right now, because there is an immediate problem of the access to food. Food is not available because of the physical barriers, and foods is very expensive because of the physical barriers in the market, and people don't have enough money to access to food. Then what they do eat very terrible food, you know, only stable food, not the nutritious food. That makes also them sick, and then when they get to COVID, they will be terrible situation. So direct social security is very important. For instance, the payment for the unemployment and SNAP program, you know, the food aid program for United States citizens should be extended rather than reduced, especially children. And actually, it should be all children from 0 to 18 should get a universal health coverage. That's extremely important. They should not be any children until age 18 should be without they will be able to access the hospital, they will be access to health services and the food services without any kind of. United States is the most richest country in the world, and they can do it. For instance, they put the stimulus package, right? How much money went to these people rather than going to companies, airlines, or the cruises and the hotels? This is a very serious issue for everywhere. They have to be definite. This is a short term, definitely social security and social protection must be important. The second, they should make important investment for cities, because cities are disconnect with the rural parts, and cities should survive themselves in this kind of situation. City farming, city and kind of this citizenship activities, making a kind of local food production definitely subsidized or promoted rather than big time staple food. These are very important and not very maybe politically difficult, but definitely should be done as soon as possible.
That's a great list. By the way, I should tell people that Hilal is with us from Turkey, and I think it's getting.
I have to turn in the lights.
Okay. Just in case people were worried about you, I should have said you were in Turkey much sooner. So I wanted to just finish up with one little question. Hilal, should we all be moving toward vegetarianism?
Well, it could be a great idea, but there are some problems on that. One problem is developing countries are very uneasy about this concept. When I give a talk, for instance, Pakistan, and I talk about this, how livestock or the animal food is very problematic in terms of environmental sustainability and also our health. They said, you know what? We just start to eat a little bit of meat. Don't touch our meat. That is one thing. So vegetarianism, maybe it's good for developed countries, upper middle class families, good. But it is not good for children because nutrition is extremely important. Yes, there is alternative nutrition. Definitely we can do it. Alternative protein, for instance, lentil or all kind of foods or fish, but fish is very expensive. The one thing that the poor people get the access to fish in the small fisheries. They are they survive with this protein. When we talk about the excessive meat, this is US, number one, incredibly higher than many other countries. Then Europe, and China is coming, but it's a long way to come. So the vegetarianism is good, but instead of vegetarianism, much more kind of balanced diet maybe would be better. For instance, breastfeeding mothers should need protein. So that kind of things might be adjusted rather than making one rule. For instance, military, I remember American military 2 years ago, maybe a year ago, they made a decision, meatless Monday. It took only 24 hours, they stopped because all the meat sector, meat lobby crushed this decision.
All the contractors, the big military contractors, my goodness. Well, thank you. Wow, we've talked about so many aspects of this story. I'm going to hand over very shortly to my colleague Charlotte Cates, who's going to handle the Q&A section here. Charlotte, hello.
Hello.
By the way, Charlotte makes a fantastic, good information in the chat. I suggest all of you, really, it's very, very good. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Hilal, and thank you, Helena, for collecting these wonderful links. This information will also be available on the resource page, which Helena was speaking about earlier. You'll be able to access all of these links on an ongoing basis after this event is over to refer back to this information for further discussion and learning and elaboration. With that being said, I want to encourage people, if you haven't already submitted your questions in the Q&A box in the chat, if you have anything that you'd like to bring forward, we have some great questions, but please do keep bringing them forward so that we can continue this great conversation. So we do have a question from Turkey Al-Faisal asking for you to elaborate further on sort of the differences and what you see is necessary regarding the World Food Program.
I didn't understand. World Food Programs, what?
Yes, like how do you see in terms of the World Food Program, the right to food, how food rights are integrated into the international system? Do you want to elaborate further on sort of what kinds of changes and you think would be necessary and important?
So World Food Program is basically actually established by the United States and also major provider of the financial part. It comes from the US. And World Food Program is doing very important job, no question about it, because it's basically humanitarian or emergency right. But because last 10, 15 years, we have a lot of emergency situation in the conflict zones, disaster areas. World Food Program is not able to really deliver necessary kind of materials. And also World Food Program recently, as I said, they changed their policies. Rather than only food aid, they try to make it food policy and food assistance, which means when they go to the countries, especially sub-Saharan Africa or the developing countries, rather than just giving you food, they are trying to helping the farmers, especially women. They teach them how to make sustainable production. World Food Program, if they manage not politically, but objectively, it would be a very important program and should be continued. But it shouldn't be politics in it. For instance, a geopolitical reason, we're going to have this place, but we don't want to have that place. That's not good. But the recent director of the World Food Program, Mr. Baisley, seems to be very enthusiastic and doing a good job. But they are a little bit more private sector oriented to my taste, but it is the small criticism maybe.
Thank you so much. Another one of the major topics that's come up in speaking about COVID, the changing world, and the inequities in the world that is confronting COVID has been climate change. And of course, climate change has a major impact on agriculture and on developing food sovereignty in countries around the world. What is your view on how climate change will affect food sovereignty and food security currently in response to COVID and also in the years to come?
Well, of course, as you said, climate change and food and agriculture has a very complex relationship. Food and agriculture is affecting, it's a victim of the climate change and also perpetrator of the climate change, because the way in which we produce food is very dangerous for the climate change. For instance, almost 35–40% of the greenhouse gas emission comes from agricultural activity, either livestock or all using pesticides or using oil-based production. They are all major problems for the climate change. So what COVID did, very interestingly enough, COVID-19, because economy sort of stopped, freeze, and the greenhouse gas emission is slowly slowing down, but this is just a short period. I don't think so it's going to be long. And also oil prices reduction also affected the climate change. In these days is a better condition than used to be. Definitely the production system should change from industrial agriculture to more agroecological system, which is respect to ecosystem, because the agricultural system is also very much affect biodiversity, pollution, and other things. And biodiversity is directly connected with COVID, actually. COVID, as you know, it's a zoonotic, or what they call zoonist, I don't know exactly, but basically animal species, from animal to human came, and it was a kind of wet food market. But there's always something, because we are invading animals' land gradually. So connection with the wild animals and people are getting more and more closer. That means we will have more virus exchange between species. So that's also connected with, of course, agricultural extension around the world. So it's all connected. I hope the system will change. Definitely, we need to go to agroecology rather than industrial agriculture.
Thank you so much. We have one more question here from Upamanyu Sengupta, who is asking, what do you think about a country like India in regards to the food crisis? Is the problem a shortage of production, or is it a crisis of purchasing power? What can be a solution for these kinds of issues in the time of COVID?
Well, India is a very, very important country, and the problems and the solutions are very unique to the country, first of all. But in COVID case, we saw very significant impact in the first place, because when they locked down in one day, actually, all the food workers had to leave to go back to their villages. They lost their job, and they were not able to even, some of them are just walked. With these people, food workers in India are extremely poor, and they are basically food insecure people. So in India, there is a significant problem of accessibility and affordability. Maybe affordability is not a problem. You can afford food still in India, but the poverty is a serious issue. So social security and social structure must be very important in order to protect farmers and the low income generated places. They have to have a job security, and at the same time, India is a major producer. So it is very difficult to answer right now the entire Indian system. But as of right now, I think the most important thing is dealing with the poverty and the food workers, and basically making bigger industrial corporations taking away the rural people's land, which is the kind of problem also. And the seed sovereignty is another issue. It's a whole bunch of issues that we have to talk another webinar right now.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your wide range of discussions regarding these issues. When you speak about food workers, I mean, this is an issue, and poverty and marginalization of food workers. This is an issue that, you know, stretches as well to the developed countries. You know, here in the United States, just the other day, a major lawsuit was filed regarding civil rights violations against food workers during COVID, who are, of course, by far majority Black and brown and people of color who were being subjected to a variety of rights violations during the crisis. So thank you for illuminating that part of the discussion. With that, I'd like to turn it back over to Just World Educational President Helena Koban for some concluding words, final thoughts as we wrap up today's webinar.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we're kind of out of time just right now, but those were some great questions that came in. Just want to remind everybody that this is part of a continuing conversation amongst our guests on the webinar. This is the 6th one of these webinars, and we're going to have 2 more. And as we go through, we're actually archiving the videos of the conversations and the transcripts and the links. And so we have this wonderful resource page on our website where you can find all these things. Next week, we're going to have another great webinar with Marjorie Cohen, who is hang on, here we go, a veteran human rights specialist and campaigner. I'm always very nervous when it comes to doing screen share, but here she is. So join us next Wednesday when Marjorie Cohen will be our guest. And the Wednesday after that, we're going to have, back by popular demand, Richard Falk, who was our first guest, and he will be, we'll have a little panel with Richard Falk and Hans von Sponeck, who is a veteran UN humanitarian official. And the 2 of them will be discussing the role of the UN and other international organizations in the COVID world. After July 22nd, we're going to take a brief pause for August. And I actually want to use that time to digest, reflect on, and exploit some of the amazing educational materials we've already created with these videos and the transcripts. And we're going to continue to plan the directions we'll take the World After COVID project in the fall. Of course, all these things, you know, we do try to run everything on a shoestring here at Just World Educational, but they do take resources. If you like what we do and you want to support our projects for the fall, go to our website, www.justworldeducational.org, and you will find a donate button, and you can go there and click and donate as much as you are able. But now mainly my role is to say a big thank you to Hilal Elver, who has been such an amazing resource. Hilal, I hope we can have you back sometime, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I enjoy very much the question and conversation with you. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Hilal. Thank you, Charlotte Cates, who's been working behind the scenes here, and all the attendees, all of you who've been here asking questions, hopefully taking notes. We will be sharing all the links that were in the chat box. We'll be sharing those on our resource center. But if you want to save the chat box, I think you can do that. So thank you, everybody, and see you next Wednesday here with Marjorie Cohen. Goodbye and stay safe.
Thank you. Goodbye.